So, Kamala Harris is heading to Michigan. Donald Trump is heading to Atlanta, Georgia, staying in the battleground states. Let's bring in Kethevane Gorjestani, our international affairs editor. Set the scene, what's going on here in terms of the strategies that we've seen in the past 24 hours.
Well, this is what is called in U.S. politics the closing arguments strategy. You have 1 week to go before Election Day, and they're really focusing, doubling down on their closing message to their voters. And you're seeing one thing in common, which is sort of going for fear in very different ways. Donald Trump, we saw at Madison Square Garden, really doubled down on that extreme rhetoric, especially when it comes to immigrants. He also repeated his line about going after the enemies from within, i.e. his political opponents. He talked about how the country was being overtaken by criminal gangs. You had a very angry, xenophobic, racist speech and tones during most of that speech. You had some of the other speakers that did much worse than what Donald Trump actually said. And that is the strategy, targeting that, the sort of it's us versus them when it comes to immigration. Kamala Harris has also gone a little bit darker, if you will, put aside the brat summer, the joy and the hope. And now she's focused on a much more serious message, which is Donald Trump is a threat to American democracy. He's going to take away your rights. He's going to turn the military against U.S. citizens. She called him a fascist just a few days ago. And it's not surprising that tomorrow, for her closing argument speech, she has chosen a symbolic location, the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. For those who remember what happened in 2021, that's what Donald Trump gave his Stop the Steal speech on January 6th before a mob attacked the Capitol. So very symbolic location for Kamala Harris. The goals, however, of the strategy are very different. For Donald Trump, it seems that by going dark, by using that rhetoric, he is focused on his base. He's no longer trying to convince persuadable voters. He's trying to fire up his base and getting the people who would vote for him out to actually cast their ballot. For Kamala Harris, the fact that she's focusing on the threat to democracy seems to be indicating that she is still hoping to get some of those persuadable voters, because the threat to democracy is sort of the common denominator between the progressives, the moderate Democrats, some of the independents, and some of the moderate Republicans, the sort of never-Trumpers who are uncomfortable with Donald Trump's rhetoric and who need a sort of nudge to come over and vote for Kamala Harris. So similar strategy, but with very different goals for the two candidates in this final week.
What strikes me as really interesting, you've referred to, we're kind of seeing early days Kamala Harris. A lot of analysts talked about this, the happy warrior, laughing, joking. That's changed. We're seeing in the last week on rally stage a repetition of similar rhetoric from both candidates. You talk about it going darker. Some analysts call this the podcast election too, and it's kind of a different way to sneak into the algorithm of our mobile phones. 3 hours with Donald Trump and Joe Rogan. It's been seen by, 30 million plus people already on YouTube. Very much male. Kamala Harris very much attracting most of the female voters right now. And you could argue, Kethevane, does it matter, given that we're kind of in a scenario where people have made a decision? But it gets back to your point, doesn't it, that the swing states, we're talking about maybe a few tens of thousands of people deciding on an election where, more than 150 million people are voting. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, there's always the question as to what strategy actually works. And if you look at the past couple of months, you would argue on both sides that nothing they've done has really managed to move the needle. They're still neck and neck, and they've been basically neck and neck for the past few months, or at the very least, few weeks. So the question of does it matter is obviously one that is true, but in an election that is this close, and it goes to your point about the few thousand votes that will likely decide this election in a few states, any small movement, any small group of voters that you manage to get to your side that would have otherwise stayed at home or voted for the other candidate might be enough to tip the scale in your favor. And so you do whatever you can to make sure that all the people who would have voted for you actually get off the couch and go cast their ballot. And you try to convince, even if it's 10,000 people here, 10,000 people there. Those people who possibly would have cast their ballot for your opponent to come over to your side, or maybe even just stay home. So that is the dual strategy. And just to really insist on how close this is going to be, flashback to 2020, it was decided by around 300,000 votes out of 156 million, I think, in the end, people who cast their ballot within 6 states. And some of the states were around 10, 11, 12,000. Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, all of these were just a few thousand votes that determined that it was Joe Biden who was going to win and not Donald Trump. And things could, if we trust the polls, be even tighter this time around. And you have to remember also one fact, which is that about a quarter of the turnout of 2020, about a quarter of those people have already voted. 41 million plus people have already voted in the United States. So right now, it's about getting those people who haven't voted yet, who could still change their mind or decide whether or not to vote. Those are the people that you're focusing on in this final stretch.
The thread of most of these stories we're talking about today ultimately come down to being affected directly or indirectly by the elections. I was talking to Lindsay Hilsum, the Channel 4 International Affairs editor, a couple of days ago. She talked about her essential deployment kit to sleepless nights, a lot of hours, whatever deployment she says. It's the fragments of a bullet, of a near miss, a bit of whiskey and poetry. As Fraser Jackson this yesterday, you're about to leave us to Washington. What's in your essential broadcast kit?
Well, I'm a very concrete type of person, so it's more about trying to last throughout this week of coverage. So comfortable shoes, because we're going to be standing for hours on end. A power bank, so your phone doesn't die in the middle of a live, maybe with you. And finally, to your point about sleepless night, earplugs, because if you have 2 or 3 hours of sleep, you want to get actually those 3 hours of sleep. So that's my
No whiskey.
pack. I mean, I might go to a bar and have a little bit of a drink. In moderation, of course.